Okay, so what I'm going to do here, so the plan for the tutorials is that we're going to dig deep into PSID as well as nonlinear dynamical modeling of neurobehavioral data. So what I'll do is just remind you some of the method elements and dig deeper into each of those. And then I'll transition to Omid, and he'll talk about the notebook globally, so you know all the elements that are involved, and then we'll get down to business and actually the hands-on session. Okay, so as you recall, the motivation for PSID was that if you have a specific behavior whose neural dynamics you're interested in, we want to actually directly dissociate and tease apart the elements in the latent states that are shared between neural activity and behavior, essentially those green behaviorally relevant states. And the reason we need a new learning algorithm to do this is that because if we learn a model of neural dynamics unsupervised with respect to behavior, we may find those red states that are in neural activity but not shared with behavior, and they may confound the green states. If we use representational modeling, we may get the blue states that are in the behavior but not necessarily present in our neural recordings. So PSID essentially solves this problem of dissociating those shared neural dynamics with behavior. Now, I showed you the intuition behind this. So it's based on a linear dynamical system model of neural behavioral data. It has the capability to dissociate the elements that are behaviorally relevant from the rest. And it's based on projections. So I didn't talk about the details of how the learning algorithm works. So that's what I'm going to do now a little bit. OK, so how does the learning algorithm work? The intuition, as I mentioned before, is that these green states should summarize everything you know about future behavior signals in terms of past neural signals. So in the first step, what PSID does is that it performs a projection of future behavior onto past neural activity. And then we show in the paper that this projection, after we perform a singular value decomposition, can give us those shared green states. Now, if you're only interested in behaviorally relevant latent state, at this point you're done. You can just fit the model parameters using least squares method. But let's say you're like, OK, no, I want the additional latent states that describe more and more neural variance. Then that's not a problem. So in a second stage, what we can do is we can ask the question of how much of the neural dynamics in the future are not already explained by these green states. So what is the residual future neural dynamics that is unexplained? So we do a projection from that residual future neural signals onto past neural signals, and then we show that through another singular value decomposition, we can get the additional latent states. Once you get these states, then the fitting of model parameters just least squares. So it's very, very simple. Okay? So this is the learning algorithm in a nutshell. There's a lot of details in the paper and proofs that you can go through as well. So once we learn the model, then the inference of the latent states in a new data set has nothing to do with behavior, as I mentioned. Essentially, you look at those two top lines. That's just a dynamic model of neural data. You build the corresponding Kalman filter with the parameters PSID learn. You extract the latent states. Then you can also transform it with CZ to get predictions of behavior and look at the accuracy of behavior decoding. In particular, all of these methods, neurodynamical modeling, representational modeling, and PSID, have the exact same inference or decoding structure, which is Kalman filter, because they're based on this linear dynamical system backbone. But the difference is in the learning, in what parameters they use in the Kalman filter, and that makes all the difference. All right, so let me show you some simulations to showcase some of the strength of doing this joint modeling. So first, we looked at whether PSID can learn all of the model parameters. So in simulated data, we basically simulate data from a known model. Then we look at the error in estimating each of the model parameters. And we showed that all of the model parameters are converging to their true values with errors that go below 1%. Then we said, OK, let's look at the dynamics as specified by the eigenvalues of the state transition matrix. We've talked about this in the introductory slides, but these are complex conjugate numbers. They characterize the dynamics. the oscillation frequency as well as time decay in response to excitations. So we looked at these within simulated models and how well we can learn them. So we simulate 100 random systems with 4 behaviorally relevant states and 16 total states. And we'll look at the eigenvalue error, or equivalently, we call them modes. So mode error of PSID versus NDM, which is unsupervised, and across different state dimensions. So what you can see here is that with just 4 states, PSID can perfectly learn the behaviorally relevant mode, whereas NDM has quite a bit of a high error with 4 states. And even when you increase the state dimension to 16, still this unsupervised NDM has a higher error. So this shows you how PSID needs a much lower dimension to extract the behaviorally relevant states. Now, if we look at these errors in the log scale to see better, we can also look at the sample efficiency of the different methods, meaning how many training samples do you need for each method to get to the same error value. So if you look here, even to get the low error of NDM at 16 dimension, PSID needs orders of magnitude fewer training samples, so 500 times less. And of course, the reason for this is that it has the ability to learn much simpler model with lower dimensional states, and therefore can learn those simpler models more efficiently with fewer training samples, whereas NDM needs to learn a much more complex model, associate model capacity to states you don't need, and therefore is much less accurate and needs more training samples. Okay, so that's kind of in simulation. So we learn the model parameters perfectly, well, with error converging to 0. We can learn a behaviorally relevant state with much smaller state dimensions, and we need much fewer training samples. Now, in the notebook, you get experience with these 4 use cases on an actual data set, a public data set from the Miller's lab. And Omid will go through that notebook. But I'm going to list these use cases and show you some results to give kind of an introduction. So the first use case is more accurate modeling of behaviorally relevant neural dynamics. So this is something I showed you already in the introductory slides. So I showed you that PSID does better decoding of movement at every single state dimension in this reach and grasp neural data set, and can do this better decoding with a lower dimensional state, even compared to nonlinear unsupervised methods. So you will look at this, not in this data set, but in the public data set by the Miller lab and confirm exactly similar results. Now, another interesting result that I wanted to show you is that PSID can do better decoding of behavioral dimensions that are actually unseen in the training data. For example, here I have 27 joint angles. What I can do is I can drop some of these joint angles from my training set, train PSID on the rest of the joint angles, and then ask, OK, the unseen joint angle, how well are those decoded compared with NDM? And I'm showing you the decoding of unseen joint angles. And you can see that PSID does better even for the unseen joint angles. Of course, when you drop all of the joints, you reduce to NDM, because there's no supervision signal in your training set. So that's the extreme case. But as long as you have some behavior dimensions, you can actually train PSID models that decode the unseen joints better as well. And this is extension to additional neural modalities and data set. This was a saccadic eye movement data sets with raw LFE. Exactly similar results held, better decoding, lower dimensions. You'll get this in also the Miller data set in your notebook. The second use case is the dissociation of behaviorally relevant neural dynamics while learning the additional neural dynamics. Of course, every benefit I've shown you so far is because of that. But here I'm going to show you more explicitly what that dissociation looks like. So to see this, we basically ran 3 methods, so PSID, NDM, PCA, as we increased the state dimension. And we looked at the behavior decoding versus neural reconstruction. So as I'm climbing up these curves, I'm increasing the state dimensions for all 3 methods. So you can see that as I increase the state dimension, PSID first is climbing up the behavior decoding axis. This shows you more explicitly how it's dissociating behaviorally relevant dynamics, because it's first finding those states that are most predictive of behavior and therefore climbing up this way. But if you look at NDM or PCA, they're not climbing up. They're actually going, basically climbing both axes, and therefore they're getting states that are mixed up. There's no dissociation involved. Now, if I give PSID more and more states, it keeps climbing, this time on the neural reconstruction axis. So it can get you the additional latent states that are explaining neural activity. So this more explicitly shows you this power for dissociation. The third use case is dimensionality reduction of neural data while preserving behavior information. In particular, I already showed you that for good decoding, we need a much lower state dimension. Now, we can actually dig deeper into this finding and ask, okay, was the dimensionality low in PSID because either behavior or neural activity had low dimensions, or was it low because the shared dynamics were low dimensional? So here we fit dynamical models to behavior on its own, neural activity on its own, and you can see that those dimensions are much, much higher individually. But what is low is the shared dimensionality that we find here. Now, because we can get these efficient representations with low dimensional states, this is also a very good tool for visualizing your data. So let's say we do this a lot, right? We apply PCA, we look at neural rotation. So we can do the same with PSID, but this time you know that your visualization is behavior informed. So let's look at what this visualization of low dimensional states look like. So we did this visualization for this reach, grasp, and return movement data set. So remember the task, reaching to a target, grasping it, bringing back my hand, returning my hand to a resting position. So we looked at two-dimensional neurodynamic models and two-dimensional PSIDs so that we can actually visualize the states on a plane. So when you look at the reach movement, so going towards the target, both NDM and PSID find these rotations. And this is something you see across a lot of motor data sets, right? These rotational patterns. So we said, okay, let's now look at the dynamics during the return movement. So if you look at NDM, you again find rotations, but these rotations during reach and return are maintaining the same direction. So this is a bit strange because the movement itself is changing direction, right, during reach and return. And the striking difference occurs in PSID. So during return, the rotation in PSID actually does change direction, which is more congruent with what's happening in the behavior. So this gives us an intuition that the left rotational patterns are more behaviorally relevant than the right one, which we can quantitatively confirm by looking at the decoding of the left pattern compared to the right pattern. Now, an interesting question that you may ask me is, what is going on? How is this possible? At the end of the day, both of these methods are operating on same neural data. So these rotations actually coexist in your neural data set. How could that be possible? What would that look like? So this is kind of like a cartoon explanation of what can happen here. So let's say you have 3 neurons, and this is what the latent trajectory looks like in 3D space. So when we do dimensional reduction, right, we're projecting essentially either dynamically or statically to a hyperplane. So if I project this movement onto the y1, y2 plane, I'm going to get rotations that maintain the same direction. If I project it onto the y2, y3 plane, I'm going to find rotations that change direction. So these rotations can indeed coexist. And what this intuitively shows is that PSID is finding you the subspace of neural data that is a behaviorally relevant subspace, and that's why you get congruent rotational patterns with behavior. So what NDM finds is indeed true. It does exist. It's just not as behaviorally relevant. All right, we also confirmed that this held regardless of which behavioral parameters we model. So our general modeling is for 27 joint angles, but the same reverse directional rotations show up if I only look at the arm angles, if I just look at the finger angles, or I look at muscle activations or EMGs inferred from a musculoskeletal model. These reverse directional rotations also held across different brain regions. So M1, PMD, PMV, PFC all had these reverse rotational patterns with PSID, whereas they didn't with NDM. Okay, so this is kind of a deep dive into the PSID results, and as you'll see in the notebook, you get a lot of experience with a bunch of them using the public Miller dataset. Okay, but as we discussed this morning, all of what PSID does is doing, at the end of the day, is based on a linear dynamical system model of neural and behavioral data, which is, of course, a very powerful, great interpretable model, fast, efficient, but it doesn't have the ability to take into account nonlinearity, and it also is not easily extendable to categorical behaviors because both of these signals are continuous signals. So if you have a categorical behavior, let's say decision choices, then, or you have intermittent behavior measurements, you can't apply it. So that was the motivation to develop a nonlinear dynamical model for neural and behavioral data to take into account nonlinearities and diverse behavioral distributions. So as I described this morning, this model essentially writes the transformation between neural activity and behavior in terms of these four maps: mapping to a latent state, dynamics of that state, mapping to behavior and neural activity. Each of these mappings can be made linear. We want to make also behavior categorical or intermittent, and we want to allow this to run even without any trial structure. So the model backbone is a recurrent neural network that takes as input neural activity and as output predicts behavior and neural activity. Each of the parameters in the RNN correspond to one of these interpretable mappings. And we can make them linear or nonlinear, linear in the form of a matrix multiplication, or nonlinear in the form of a feed-forward neural network. Now, how do we learn the parameters of this RNN? That's the question. Using neural behavioral data and in a manner that we now can dissociate nonlinear behaviorally relevant dynamics. This is a 4-step optimization that can achieve this dissociation. In the first 2 steps, we optimize the log likelihood of behavior to get the behaviorally relevant dynamics, and in the last 2 steps, we optimize the log likelihood of neural activity to get the additional neural dynamics. So what I'm going to do is to dig a little bit deeper into these optimizations and how they work, so that when you go to the notebook, get practice with it, you roughly know what is happening. So here's the summary of the optimization. So the first optimization tries to fit a section of this RNN. So this is a dynamical model, right? It's a nonlinear yet dynamical model. So it tries to fit this section of RNN that maximizes the behavior log likelihood. Now, because behavior is here Gaussian, log likelihood optimization is equivalent to optimizing the mean squared error between predicted behavior and behavior. So the first optimization tries to get these green state by optimizing how well you can predict behavior from neural activity, and learns the other parameters as well. Then the second optimization finds the mapping from those green states to neural activity, so a nonlinear regression by optimizing now the prediction of neural activity. Again, because things are Gaussian, mean squared error is equivalent to log likelihood optimization. So once we get these green states, we go to the third and fourth optimization steps. In the third optimization step, we find these additional latent states while using the states from the first 2 optimization as a prior. So we do input the green state as a prior into the third optimization step. And now we are again optimizing log likelihood of neural activity, which is equivalent to mean squared error in predicting neural activity. But notice that my prediction actually has an element corresponding to the prediction from this green state, which comes as a prior from the first 2 optimization steps. And the rest is captured by the additional states. And then finally, we get the regression from these additional states to behavior in case we need to also extract some behavior information from the additional states. So this is essentially this last optimization essentially to make the method general in case you don't associate enough latent states in the first 2 stages. Okay, So this is for Gaussian signals. Now, what about categorical behaviors? What do we change in this 4-step optimization algorithm? Of course, we change the distribution of the z variable, which is our behavior, to a categorical distribution. To do this, what we have to do is to change the dimensionality of the output to be the behavior dimension times the number of classes or categories, right? Then we have to make sure that the output is a probability, so sums to 1. That's why we apply a softmax normalization. And finally, the log likelihood for a categorical distribution can be computed through this cross-entropy operation between essentially the predicted probability of the class versus the true behavior class. So if you look at the cross-entropy, you can find the log likelihood for this behavior, which is categorical. So that's what we do to address categorical variables. Now, we have the nonlinearity addressed. We have the categorical behaviors addressed. And finally, we can address intermittent behaviors through masking. So whenever you don't have a behavior, you just mask it in your loss function when you're running your gradient descent. OK. So that's kind of the details of the optimization. Now, what you'll also see in the notebook is that when we want to build a fully nonlinear or flexibly nonlinear model, we also do hyperparameter optimization. So in order to get the best possible nonlinear model, we do searches over possibilities for each of our parameters. So we allow them to either be linear or nonlinear. If nonlinear, we allow them to try either having 1 or 2 hidden layers, having 64 or 128 units in each hidden layer. And then we allow also for an LSTM as our recursion. So this gives a total of 90 cases over which we search, and we select one model based on training data. So we do this because, if you remember, we're doing hypothesis testing about where the nonlinearities are. And we want to make sure our fully nonlinear, flexibly nonlinear model is as good as possible so we can compare against it. So this is the kind of hyperparameter selection. All right, so I've shown you some of the results already. We actually tested across these 4 data sets, the reach and grasp, Saccade data set, and then the cursor reaching data sets. We looked at different modalities, raw LFP, LFP power, and spiking. And these were the 4 use cases with which you'll get practice in the tutorial. So first, nonlinear modeling of neural behavioral data across modalities. So I already showed you that nonlinear neural behavioral data does better decoding of behavior compared with linear PSID across all modalities, showing that we better extract the behaviorally relevant dynamics. And that's something that we can get practice with in the tutorial. We also showed nonlinear dimensionality reduction, meaning we can summarize behavior information in a much lower dimensional state compared to an unsupervised nonlinear RNN. And now this dimensionality reduction, this efficient dimensionality reduction, again opens the possibility to visualization. So one thing I thought might be interesting is to visualize the trajectories in the same reach and grasp data set for this nonlinear method. And you can see that when I make my unsupervised method even nonlinear, I still get rotations in the same direction. So the nonlinearity doesn't solve the fact that you didn't get the reverse directional rotation. It's really the dissociation that gives you that with the nonlinear method as well. And these are example trajectories in the Miller data set. So you can see this is what this neurobehavioral model finds. The trajectories are very congruent with behavior, so interpretable, whereas unsupervised methods, trajectories are not as separable based on behavior categories. The localization of the source, you'll have an exercise there in the tutorial as well. We showed you that across all 4 data sets, when we did hypothesis testing, we found the source to be in the readout from latent dynamics, meaning summarizing things there was as good as a fully nonlinear model and better than every individual nonlinearity. And finally, we talked about generalization to categorical behavior. Here, task epochs. I showed you how we extend to categorical behaviors. This shows you that the benefits still hold in terms of this method, doing better decoding and being on the performance frontier compared with an unsupervised RNN. What I didn't show you was the intermittently sampled behaviors. So to show you that intermittently sampled behaviors also work, we just drop samples in our training set when we train this nonlinear model. And you can see that even when we drop 80% of the behavior samples in the training set, still we do better decoding compared with linear PSID. So the intermittent sampling also works, and this holds for all of our data sets. Okay, so that's the last use case. And with that, I'm going to give the stage to Omid, who will walk you globally through the notebook, and then we'll get to the hands-on session.
Hi, everyone. My name is Omid. As Maryam mentioned, we're going to have two notebooks. One of them goes through some use cases of PSID with some hands-on experience, and the other one goes through the use cases of DPAD, the nonlinear modeling framework. So I'm just going to give a very quick overview of both notebooks before we go through running all the codes together. All right. So in the PSID notebook, we start by reviewing the model formulation, which, as Maryam also explained in the lecture, is a linear stasis model where the latent state describes the dynamics of both neural activity, represented by Y, and behavior, represented by Z. But the key goal of PSID is to dissociate the elements of X that are shared, describe both neural activity and behavior, from those that are only related to neural activity. In other words, it learns X with a structure that has the parts that are shared between neural activity and behavior, or are behavior relevant neural dynamics, separated out as X1, and the other potentially other neural dynamics separated out as X2. And we can just learn the behavior relevant neural dynamics, and optionally also learn the additional neural dynamics as X2. And this idea of we can directly go only learn behavior relevant neural dynamics is the key feature that allows PSID to learn simpler models that require fewer training samples for training and achieve more accurate models of behavior relevant neural dynamics given the same training data. All right, so in this notebook, we will go over the basic API of using the PSID library, which is available on GitHub. Although in this notebook, we have a few functions that we haven't put on GitHub yet. We're going to add them too. But the basic use cases, the basic library is already available on GitHub. So you simply import PSID, and the learning is as simple as one function where you pass your neural time series as a 2D vector, and behavior time series as another 2D vector, and your number of desired latent states, total number of desired latent states, and the ones that you want to dedicate to trying to extract behavior relevant dynamics. So these N1, this N1 determines the dimension of the first part of latent states, the ones that are trying to learn the shared dynamics between neural activity and behavior. And finally, a hyperparameter called the horizon, which we'll talk about, but typically a value of around 5 or 10 is okay. And this simple function returns an object that contains all the learned model parameters and can also process new data. So you simply can call the predict function of the returned learned model and pass it some new data, new neural data, time series, and it would give you the prediction of behavior from that neural data time series. It's the causal prediction of behavior using all past neural data for each time step, and the prediction of neural activity from its own past. So this is what we call a self-prediction, the one-step prediction of neural activity, and the latent states that are the underlying states that produce these predictions. Well, that API is fairly simple. Then we'll go through using the API to actually do modeling first in a simulated model, so that we know all the ground truth details of the model. And then we'll work with data, public data from the Miller lab to go through several use cases of PSID in actual data. All right, so in this simulated model, we have two latent states that are shared between neural activity and behavior relevant, and two latent states that are just driving neural activity but not behavior. And we also have two dynamical states that drive behavior but are not represented in neural activity. So to better see what that means, I have some expanded formulations here for you. So our state equation in this simulated system has 4-dimensional states being a function of their own past plus some noise. What it means that all these 4 states drive neural activity is that our neural activity readout matrix CY simply doesn't have 0 columns. So all of the columns are multiplied by all of the 4 states to produce our neural activity. In contrast, only 2 of the latent states drive behavior. That means the behavior readout matrix CZ has 2 columns that are 0. And we have dynamics that are in the behavior but not in neural activity. Those are these error signals in behavior. This is not a white noise. It's actually in the simulation is produced from a separate state space model with 2 latent state dimensions. So this X prime here is a 2-dimensional state, dynamic state that produces our behavior noise. With that, I think that should give a better idea of what the simulated model here is. And then we will go through an example of, well, we produce data from the simulated model, and then we would cut the data into training and testing, and then we would pass the data to PSID to learn a model. We will see that once we use that model to predict behavior, even if the model has only 2 dimensions. So just enough to learn all the behavior relevant neural dynamics. Indeed, PSID learns a model that reaches the same behavior decoding accuracy as the ideal complete model that we know in this case because we are doing a simulation. So this just shows that we correctly can prioritize learning of behavior relevant dynamics when we don't have enough states. Then we show that if you provide more states to PSID so that it also learns other neural dynamics, it manages to also learn other neural dynamics that are not behavior relevant. So we can see that by comparing the neural self-prediction of PSID and the true model in the simulation. The neural self-prediction is the accuracy of predicting each sample of neural activity after observing all the past samples of neural activity. So that quantification shows that we reach the same self-prediction accuracy as the ideal model. So optionally, if needed, we can give PSID additional states to explain all the neural dynamics, even those that are not relevant to behavior. All right, then we take a deeper dive into how the predict function works. Because the model that PSID learns is a linear state space model, the optimal inference for it to estimate the latent states from neural activity is a Kalman filter. So it's quite efficient, very computationally cheap. So we'll go over how simple that really is. And then we'll go over some intuitive hands-on experience with what the eigenvalues of the A matrix in a state space model represent and why they are an important indicator of the dynamics that the model describes. So eigenvalues are complex numbers that you can extract from the A matrix by doing eigenvalue decomposition. And they describe the response of the state to excitations. And that we will see with a simple simulation. So if you move around the eigenvalues over the complex plane, and then in each case pass an excitation, a delta function, to the state equation, on the right we will see that the response in terms of the oscillation frequency and the damping ratio changes depending on where the eigenvalues are. Specifically, the angle of the eigenvalue in the complex plane determines the frequency of the response to excitations. You can see that as we are increasing this angle, on the right our response has faster and faster frequency. And then we can look at a fixed frequency and then change the magnitude of the eigenvalue. That determines the decay rate of the response to excitations. So if we have a magnitude of 1, there would be no decay. And then as we decrease the magnitude, we would have more and more decay until for very small magnitudes of eigenvalue, they effectively don't linger on in the response of the system at all. They have very minimal effects on the dynamics because whatever excitation reaches them very quickly dies out. With that understanding of what eigenvalues represent and how they reflect the dynamics of the latent states, we'll then look at the eigenvalues for this simulated model, and we'll see that PSID learns them correctly. So as I mentioned, we have two states in this simulated model that are both related to behavior and neural activity. The eigenvalues for those are shown in green here in the complex plane. And the crosses are what the PSID algorithm learned. And you can see that it matches the true values that are shown with circles. And then there are two other eigenvalues that are represented in neural activity but are not deriving behavior in the simulation. Those are the red ones, also learned correctly. And then we had also two eigenvalues driving behavior but not represented in neural activity. Here we are not trying to learn those. But as a question earlier came up, those technically you could also learn them by finishing this modeling and then finding whatever is unpredictable in behavior and doing another statistics modeling on the residual behavior to learn these eigenvalues. But that's not the goal here. All right, so that wraps up basically the simulation. All of these things can also be done with trial-based data. So far we were passing a long time series of neural data and a long time series of behavior data to the method for learning. But if your data by construction comes in chunks, for example, is coming from different trials, we can also pass a list of data chunks. So here's an example. So these are lists of different trials of neural data and different trials of behavior data, and you can just pass these lists to PSID, and it can also learn the model based on chunks of data. While under the hood, what this does is different from concatenating the data. It's possible that in some cases, if your chunks are not too short relative to the horizon of the method, you can actually also concatenate data and pass that to PSID. That's also a good approximation. All right, so trial-based data is also fine. A couple of other simulation results that we have in the paper, Maryam provided an overview of, but we're not going to repeat here, is that we can learn all the model parameters. So we can individually check every single model parameters and how it converges towards the true value as the number of training samples increase. We can show that we need minimal number of states to learn the behavior relevant dynamics. We saw a simple example of it here, but across more simulated systems, we can also show that. And we can also show that because PSID prioritizes the learning of behavior relevant dynamics, it requires potentially orders of magnitude less training data to reach similar accuracy in learning these dynamics. All right. A couple of notes, I guess these are, okay, so two hyperparameters are the things you need to pass to PSID to learn your model. One is that horizon parameter that I mentioned, 5 or 10 is typically good. But ideally, you should try different values within your training data and just find the value that works best for your data. That's what we will do later in the notebook when we work with real data. Then the other parameter is N1, which is how many of the states should be extracted to focus on behavior relevant neural dynamics. This is again something that varies depending on the data, and ideally you should just try different values and pick the one that best describes the data. In the simulation, we knew what the value was, but in real data, trying different values is a more comprehensive approach. And since the learning is very quick, has a few linear algebraic steps, you can try many combinations of these hyperparameters very quickly with PSID and just find the best one that works for your data. That's what we will do later in analyzing the real data. Now, the real neural data that we analyze in this notebook is from the Miller lab, from monkeys performing random reaches on a screen. So they're controlling a cursor with a manipulandum, and targets appear in random locations. They just have to take the cursor to the target location, and then another one shows up in groups of 4. But that detail is not that important for us. So here we just want to take that real neural data. Our neural data is the spiking activity that's happening during this task, and our behavior data is the position and velocity of the cursor over time. And we want to model these neural behavioral dynamics. We'll first start by loading the data and the events of the trials and then visualizing them. So just as an example, this is the spike activity for different neurons in one of the sessions of this data set, and then a Gaussian smoothed version of the spike counts, and the 4 dimensions of behaviors, position in x and y directions and velocity in the 2 directions. And we are also separating out the trials. The shaded areas show the trials of the task. So that should give you an idea of what the task is about. And then we start with separating the data in training and testing to training and test sets. And we would train the model on the training data and then test it on the test set and compute a performance measure to see how well the predicted behavior and one-step prediction of neural activity in the test set, how accurate those are. So with these basic training functions at our disposal, then we model the data in all of the sessions of this data set. As a baseline, we also compare the modeling accuracy with neural dynamic modeling, which is just the idea of you're given neural activity, you want to fit a linear statistics model to describe it. You don't care about whether these dynamics are relevant to behavior or not. You just want to describe as much neural dynamics as possible given a number of latent states. This is implemented as a special case in PSID. So if you just pass the number of behavior relevant parameters to the PSID function to be 0, it would extract all the states without caring about behavior. So it implements this neural dynamic modeling via subspace identification as a special case. So we compare the results of our modeling with that as well. So we'll go over both methods and a series of latent state dimensions. For every session of the data, for every fold in the cross-validation fold, we will try out different values for the hyperparameters that I mentioned. So we have the n1 hyperparameter. We try all the values up to nx. And we try 2 horizon values, 5 or 10. So we try all these values within the training data of fit models and then evaluate them in another part of the training data. And finally, we find one parameter that best describes the training data. And then we use that parameter to fit a final model to the training data and then test it on the test data. And then we will store all these results. So let's go over what the results look like. So 4 use cases will be shown here. First is, because we are focusing on behavior relevant dynamics, we can learn them more accurately. We can see that by just looking at the behavior decoding accuracy. So the y-axis here is the neural decoding of behavior, how accurate that is, as a function of the number of latent states. Blue is the PSID result, and red is the NDM result. And you can see that across all the latent state dimensions, as we are increasing the latent state dimension, in all cases, PSID achieves more accurate decoding of behavior because it's prioritizing the learning of behavior relevant dynamics. So for any given fixed state dimension, it's doing better than if you didn't try to prioritize behavior-relevant neural dynamics. So that's one of the use cases, is just more accurate modeling. It's worth mentioning that we achieve the better behavior decoding accuracy while also being able to explain the overall neural dynamics, including those that are not necessarily relevant to behavior, as accurately if we have enough latent states. So to see that as a function of latent state dimensions, we now look at YCC, or neural self-prediction, the prediction of neural activity from its own past. And you can see that in very closely with a few more latent states, PSID blue reaches the same neural self-prediction as if you just try to model all neural activity without caring about behavior, the NDM result. So that's also, so basically the overall neural behavioral data is modeled accurately, especially the behavior prediction is much more accurate, but given enough states, you can also achieve similar neural prediction accuracy. The second use case that we'll go over is that by prioritizing behavior-relevant dynamics, PSID also dissociates them from other neural dynamics. And we can see that by looking at the behavior decoding accuracy of models with different latent states versus the neural self-prediction accuracy of the same models. For PSID, what we see is that as we increase the latent state dimension, each of these dots is one latent state dimension, initially we move with a very high slope towards this direction, towards the direction of improving behavior decoding accuracy, which means that these early latent states were dedicated to describing the behavior-relevant neural dynamics. Once that plateaus, there is not much more behavior-relevant dynamics left in the data. PSID starts going to, on the other axis towards explaining more and more neural dynamics that are not necessarily useful for predicting behavior. In contrast, if you use neural dynamic modeling, you kind of accumulate dynamics, both behavior relevant and irrelevant, at the same pace as you increase the latent state dimension. And you can see that here by looking at the slope of this NDM plot, the red plot. So that's a good visualization of how the early states are dissociating the behavior relevant dynamics. The later states are learning the other neural dynamics, whereas they're all mixed up if you use neural dynamic modeling. Another use case that we'll go over is how we can do dimension reduction in a way that preserves behavior relevant neural dynamics. So if we look at how many dimensions were required to reach almost the peak behavior decoding accuracy that we reach for each model. In the case of PSID, with around 8 dimensions, we already reach peak behavior prediction accuracy. You can also see that here. So with 8 dimensions, we are already there. Whereas for NDM, you need much higher dimensions to reach close to its own peak behavior decoding accuracy. And that peak behavior decoding accuracy is actually lower than the peak behavior decoding accuracy that PSID reaches. So this is a visualization of how you can do dimension reduction. If you wanted to a model that has low state dimensions, only 8, if you use PSID, you would have a model that captured all the behavior relevant information in those 8 dimensions, which is a capability you wouldn't have if you do dimension reduction with NDM. And finally, the other use case is now that we have a way of doing dimension reduction to very low dimensions in a way that preserves a lot of behavior relevant information, we can use that to visualize behavior relevant neural dynamics. So here we learn models with 2 state dimensions, so it's easy to visualize, and then visualize those 2 state dimensions. So in this task, we don't really have 8 targets, but just to partition the space of movements into distinct categories, we separate out the movements in terms of their rough overall direction of movement. So all the targets, all the trials that were moving kind of towards up and right within a window, we will categorize them as orange, all the movements in another direction as green, and so on. So we have 8 total categories of trials. And you can see this is the average position in these categories. I'm just plotting the average behavior at this point. And then this is the average velocity. You can see that the velocity starts from 0 at the beginning of each movement of the cursor and ends also at 0 because they want to stop at the target position, at the target. So now, the same 8 categories, what would we see if we average out the latent states extracted from PSID versus NDM? We can see that the latent states, so in this case, I'm fitting models with 2 latent state dimensions with both NDM and with PSID. With PSID, those 2 latent state dimensions are evolving in a way that differs a lot across these behavioral categories. And it preserves the structure of behavior. So movements that were in this direction, the green direction, are next to movements that are in the red direction, and indeed in the latent state space, also movements in the green direction are next to the red direction, and so on. Whereas in the NDM case, because it's not trying to preserve behavior information, it's just extracted something that describes more neural variants, these different behavior categories are mixed up. And we'll just also go over a version of pulling the results from all the sessions of the data set to have a more statistically significant version of this result. So you can see that overall across all the sessions and folds, the relative structure of the task behavior categories is preserved in the latent states of PSID, the ordering of these directions, whereas in NDM, it's all mixed up. All right, so that's the last use case that we'll go over in this notebook. And then we have another notebook that goes over our nonlinear dynamic modeling framework, DPAD. The model formulation for DPAD can be simplified in a simple way, written this way. So all of these 4 parameters are now general nonlinear, multi-input, multi-output nonlinear functions that we learn as neural networks. So each of these parameters, we want to be able to flexibly, first of all, say whether they are linear or nonlinear. And if they are nonlinear, we want to be able to play with their structure. Let's make that a 3-layer neural network or any option that we desire. That's the idea. So we've implemented this framework with numerical optimization because none of the linear algebra approach of PSID, of course, doesn't generalize to this kind of nonlinear modeling. And we've also made everything very flexible. So you can either let the method automatically figure out what the right nonlinearity for each of these parameters is by trying them out. Or you can specifically say, I want only the state recursion to be nonlinear, which is useful in case of hypothesis testing about where the nonlinearities can be summarized, as Maryam mentioned earlier in the lecture. So we have this structure, flexible nonlinear modeling structure, but we also want to be able to dissociate behavior-relevant neural dynamics from others. So we, again, also have states partitioned into 2 parts. And to be able to learn the dynamics in 2 parts in a way that prioritizes behavior-relevant dynamics, we have a 4-step optimization to learn these parameters, which is, I think, a little bit too much to go over here. But basically, the first 2 optimization steps try to learn these latent states, the ones that drive behavior, and their mapping also to neural activity. And the latter 2 optimization steps try to learn any additional neural dynamics by explaining them with additional states, the X2s here. All right, so with that overview of the formulation, the API of the DPAD framework is also very similar to PSID. There's just one fit function, so it's very easy to use. You pass your neural data, your behavior data time series, the number of states that you want, the number of states that you want have focus on the behavior relevant dynamics. Plus, because there are so many options of what can be linear, what can be nonlinear, you can pass additional arguments to specify those, and there is a helper function that just figures out those arguments for you based on a string. So in this case, if I want to build a model that just has nonlinear behavior readout, the CZ parameter is nonlinear, I can simply pass this string to this helper function to get the arguments necessary to learn a model with that structure. And once the model is learned, there is a predict function that can take new neural data and give the prediction of behavior from the neural data and one-step prediction of neural activity and the latent states associated with these as the output. And with that, within a simulation, we'll go over 4 use cases of DPAD. First, we'll load data and separate it into training and testing. And then the first use case is, because now we have a very flexible framework that can also capture nonlinear dynamics, it would be more accurate in modeling data that contains nonlinearity. So here in our simulated data, we have nonlinearity in the model indeed. We will go over how that can be automatically learned with this flexible nonlinearity function that will try out different nonlinearities and give you what seems to best describe the data. So this output can be, for example, something like what I was showing earlier. It can be a string like this. The model has tried different things and has come to the conclusion that having nonlinearity only in CZ with a specific structure is best for describing the data, the training data. So that is one way to do things. You can just let the model try out different things and tell you what the structure of nonlinearity is that best describes the data, and then learn a model with that structure. Or you can just manually set this to whatever nonlinearity you want. You can set it to, I want the behavior readout to be nonlinear. But there is also flexibility. You can say, I want it to be nonlinear with 2 hidden layers and so on. So you can play with those, the architecture of nonlinearity as well. All right, so we will do this for this simulated data, and we will look at the evaluation of, in this case, it's a simulation, so we have the true model as well. And we will see that the learned model from DPAD converges to have the same behavior prediction accuracy and the same neural self prediction accuracy as the ideal model here, the complete true model that the data was generated from, showing that we can learn the model accurately. We can also just plot the nonlinear function of the nonlinear parameter in this model to see that the learned nonlinear parameter matches the true nonlinear parameter. In this case, in the behavior readout, we have a sinusoid type relationship between the latent state and the behavior that it produces. And the learned model almost perfectly matches the true nonlinear relationship in this behavior readout parameter. And we are flexible, so we can also say, just don't put nonlinearity anywhere. And that would be our baseline to assess quantify the level of nonlinearity in data. So we can just, with the same API exactly, ask DPAD to numerically fit models that are linear. And then we can compare the performance of those models with nonlinear models. In this case, we know that the true model is nonlinear, so we can see that the decoding accuracy of a linear model is lower than the decoding accuracy of the true model, because it's just not possible to capture this nonlinearity with a linear model. The same thing is also visualized here. So in this case, behavior decoding accuracy for the true model is the same as what we get when we allow DPAD to flexibly just try out nonlinearities and pick the best one based on the training data. But if we force it to use a linear model, of course, it can't match that decoding accuracy. And this kind of linear baseline is useful for quantifying the level of nonlinearity in data and also for hypothesis testing. If in a data set, the linear approach gives the same result as a flexible nonlinearity, that's an indication that probably nonlinearities in this data set are negligible. You can approximate the data set with a linear model. All right. The second use case is something that we're not going to go over here because we're working with simulated data, but we've seen that, as Maryam mentioned in her lecture, that if you just pass raw LFP data to DPAD to flexibly learn a nonlinear mapping from that data to behavior, it actually performs surprisingly well. Sometimes even in some data sets outperforms the spiking activity, which is an interesting idea. Instead of trying to design features that are like power features that are extracted from LFP activity, you can just let the model learn a good feature from the LFP activity. All right, another use case that we'll go over with simulations here is that by prioritizing behavior relevant dynamics, we can do dimension reduction that in this case is nonlinear, meaning we can capture nonlinearities. It's dynamic because these models are all have a temporal structure of the data learned in them. So it's different from, let's say, PCA dimension reduction in that sense. And it preserves behavior relevant information because it's trying to prioritize those dynamics, behavior relevant neural dynamics. So to see this, we'll compare a low dimensional, in this case, in the simulation, we have several states, but only one of them derives behavior, the one that derives behavior with a sinusoid function. And we can see that if we learn a model with just one state dimension, it matches the prediction accuracy of the ideal model that has more states. But if we didn't try to prioritize behavior relevant information, if we learned a similar nonlinear structure, but in a neural dynamic modeling fashion, without trying to first prioritize behavior relevant information, we would have much lower prediction accuracy because that one state that we learn would be just trying to explain as much neural variance as possible, which is not necessarily the part of neural data that is informative of behavior. So dimension reduction that preserves behavior relevant information and is dynamic is another use case of DPAD. And two other use cases. Another use case is we can, of course, use this flexibility to test hypotheses about where we can summarize the nonlinearities in the neural behavioral data. So we can compare our flexible model that tries all combinations of nonlinearities to find the best model for the data. We can compare that with a model that has nonlinearity only in behavior readout, only in neural readout, only in the state recursion, only in the mapping from neural activity to the latent state, or with linear models. So when we compare all these manually designed types of nonlinearities that isolate nonlinearity in different parts of the model, when we compare these, we find that in this simulation, we know that the nonlinearity in the simulated model is really only in the behavior readout parameter, CZ. And we can see that when we compare all these options, all of them are much worse than the true location for nonlinearity, which is CZ. These are all on top of each other, so it might be a little bit hard to see. But the plus is also there, which is flexibly allowing DPAD to just find the best nonlinearity. And the ideal model is also there, which is available because we are doing a simulation here. But if we put the nonlinearity anywhere else, we get worse result. So if we do a hypothesis testing like this in real data and find that putting nonlinearity just in one location of the model is the same as the best we can do if we allow nonlinearity to be everywhere, that's the kind of hypothesis testing capability that we're talking about. It would suggest that in that data, nonlinearities in neural behavior data can be summarized in that parameter.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
If allow the system to have in its state space.
Mm-hmm.
Would ultimately the A nonlinear jump up and grab the CZ nonlinear because it can sort of hide, it can sort of put inside its X parameters a copy?
Yeah, that's a good point. In this simplified case, yes, I'm using the same dimension for all of them. And I think it should be possible to just take in some of the readout nonlinearity and push it inside the state recursion if I allow a high dimensional state. So I didn't mention it, but in real data, you should allow the state dimension for all of these options to go very high to converge to a plateau, so that with that architecture and as many states as it needs, you know what neural prediction and behavior decoding you can do. Then you can do the hypothesis testing. So these peak performances with their best state dimensions, are they different? Which one is better? In this case, you're right. This graph can change if I allow the state dimensions to go much higher. That's a very good question. OK. And final use case that we'll go over in this notebook is, of course, we are in the realm of numerical optimization. So it's fairly flexible, and we can admit additional extensions such as modeling non-Gaussian data or intermittently sampled data. And we'll go over an example of just taking the same data from the same simulated model and just categorizing it, thresholding it into 3 levels, so that we have now a categorical behavior that is either 0, 1, or 2 at each point in time. So the distribution is completely different. It's not Gaussian anymore. It's categorical. But the same modeling framework can work by adjusting the likelihood appropriately. And we show that indeed you outperform in terms of behavior prediction accuracy, which in this case is behavior classification accuracy. You outperform models that do not try to prioritize behavior relevant information. With that, I think this was an overview of both notebooks, and then we'll go cell by cell in each of them later.